Welcome, everyone. We'll get started really soon. Hello, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We will get started very soon. We're just going to give a minute for folks to trickle in. Welcome, everyone. We're just giving a couple minutes for folks to get in, but we will get started here in just a couple of seconds. All right. All right, we are going to get started now as people continue to trickle in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this town hall on the proposed Seattle Charter Amendment 29, also known as the Compassion Seattle Charter Amendment. My name is Camille Gix. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Committee Chair for the 43rd District Democrats. I want to give a special thank you to the 43rd Policy Committee and the Executive Board members who have helped make this happen tonight. I'm going to start us off by explaining a bit about what the format is going to look like tonight. It will be broken into two segments. One for the Compassion Seattle campaign, which is being represented tonight by John Scholes, and one for the opposition campaign and coalition House Our Neighbors, being represented by Dee Powers. During their respective segments, they will have 5 minutes to introduce their campaign, 20 minutes to respond to questions from our moderator, and an additional 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions. We ask that the panelists keep their responses to 2 minutes in order to get through as many questions as possible. And while everyone is welcome to raise questions, we ask that folks please step back to allow for members of our unhoused communities to go first, as they are the folks that are going to be most directly impacted by this issue. Throughout the moderator Q&A portion, you may direct your questions to me. I am one of the co-hosts. My name is Camille Gix again, or Maddie Von Hoff in the chat, and your questions will be considered for the Q&A section. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for this event, the 43rd's own Jessie Murray. Jessie is a Capitol Hill renter and member of the 43rd Legislative District. A member of the queer community, Jessie has been advocating at the city level for solutions to housing insecurity on behalf of the Seattle LGBTQ Commissioner, where she is serving a 3rd term as co-chair. She is also a former candidate for office, having run for the 43rd LD House Rep Position 2 in 2020 on a platform of progressive taxation to fund additional affordable housing and transit. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jessie.
Thank you so much, Camille. Really excited for the discussion tonight. As Camille mentioned, we have 2 representatives here tonight. We are going to be starting with the Compassion Seattle representative, John Scholes. So brief bio. John has been the president and CEO of the Downtown Seattle Association since 2014, believing the health of downtown Seattle is critical to a healthy city and region. He is also a member of the board of Visit Seattle, the International Downtown Association, Transportation Choices Coalition, and the Downtown Emergency Service Center. He has served on a number of city and county task forces on transportation, homelessness, and housing. John is a Puget Sound Business Journal 40 Under 40 award winner and a graduate of Leadership Tomorrow. Thank you for being here. Later on, we will have a representative from House Our Neighbors Coalition, Dee Powers. They are currently the president of the board for the organization Be Seattle, which works to connect people with resources in order to help empower both houseless and renter neighbors. Dee also runs a mutual aid coordination station down in Sodo called the Way Station that provides essential survival supplies to our unsheltered neighbors. In 2015, Dee was priced out of a downtown apartment and has been living in an RV ever since. Thank you both for being here tonight. As Camille mentioned, we're going to have a format where we start with the Compassion Seattle open speech, essentially. Then we'll have moderator questions followed by questions from the audience. And then we'll rinse and repeat for the House Our Neighbors side. So first, I would love for John Scholes and Compassion Seattle to introduce himself. And I would love, as part of that, could you explain why a charter amendment in particular, as opposed to going through the normal legislative process?
Great. Well, thanks, Jesse. I really appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to be with you all tonight. Again, I'm John Scholes, and I head up the Downtown Seattle Association. And for those who aren't familiar with the organization, we've been around since the late 1950s and work to promote a healthy, vibrant downtown on behalf of the arts community, nonprofits, property owners, residents, small businesses, and others that have an interest in investment in a healthy urban core in our downtown. As part of that work, for many decades, we've been involved in homeless and low-income housing issues. Helped start and found Bellwether Housing in the late 1970s and early 80s, which is now our largest nonprofit housing provider in the city. We manage a homeless outreach team of 9 mental health professionals and case managers and street-based outreach workers that are working to connect folks that are unsheltered in downtown with housing services and employment. And we also have, for the last 20 years, operated a second chance employment program and have employed more than 1,000 formerly homeless individuals and individuals coming out of the criminal legal system with jobs and full benefits within our Cleaning Ambassador program and maintain that program today. So we're very close to this issue of homelessness in downtown and the crisis we see across our city. And it's a crisis and a problem that we entered the pandemic with, and the pandemic in many ways has worsened it for those that are suffering outside in our parks and public spaces, and the impact that has on our neighborhoods throughout the city of Seattle, including downtown. It's almost 6 years since our city and county declared a state of emergency around homelessness. And in that period, while there's been important investments made and important efforts by some of our great nonprofit housing and service providers, we've seen the population of particularly the chronically homeless, but the overall unsheltered population in our city grow. And we're spending more money today than ever before. This is a problem that has only worsened. And today, Seattle finds itself with the 3rd largest unsheltered population within the United States, behind the Los Angeles and New York. So the status quo, the current approach, the current course and speed is not working. Not for those that are suffering in our parks, on our sidewalks and alleys and public spaces, and not for our neighborhoods, our park system, small businesses and others that are looking to reopen their doors. So we came together with a number of other organizations earlier this year to develop an amendment to our city charter. We chose the charter because this is a serious issue. The charter is a serious document. And the current approach is failing. And we think elected officials and politicians have had their opportunity for many years to align around an effective, accountable, compassionate approach to address this issue, but we haven't seen that. We're going in the wrong direction. So we think it's time for voters to have their say and to adopt an approach and a framework and a set of principles and priorities within our city's charter. We think that's an appropriate place to address this issue, and that's what Charter Amendment 29 would allow, and should it receive the required number of signatures, appear on the ballot in November. We sought the input of more than a dozen nonprofit service and housing providers back in February and March. Organizations including the United Way and Plymouth Housing, the Downtown Emergency Service Center, which I serve on the board of, the Public Defender Association, SEIU 1199, which represents a number of the workers at DESC and some of the other nonprofits, REACH, Evergreen Treatment, Sound Mental Health, and a number of other organizations. We engaged them in a series of meetings and deep dialogue on the specific text and content of the charter amendment. We took their input, and their input was reflected in the version that was filed back in early April. After it was filed, they provided some additional input, which we took, and we refiled the initiative. And you can see what those organizations are saying about the charter amendment on the website, compassionseattle.org. And real briefly, the amendment would do a number of things. It would require the city of Seattle to provide mental health and substance use treatment to those that are suffering on the street. The city does not invest in treatment for substance use or mental health today. We know that a majority of the folks who are chronically homeless throughout our city are suffering from one or both of those conditions. So this amendment requires the city to invest in treatment to meet people where they are with the services that they need. Also requires the city to make a substantial investment in temporary emergency housing, in addition to permanent supportive housing. Recognizing that there are nearly 4,000 folks that are outside today, that we are making record investment in permanent housing and permanent supportive housing, which is critically important. But on the current course and speed we're on, it's going to be many years before that housing is available for the folks that are outside today. This amendment requires the city to make investments in temporary emergency housing that can be stood up faster and cheaper, so that we can get people inside into healthier, better, safer situations than they are today. It in many ways builds on the success that we're seeing at a small scale in our city through the recently established Just Care program that's primarily been working in the greater downtown, in the International District, and in Pioneer Square to provide culturally competent and appropriate outreach services, counseling, and emergency housing, primarily through the availability of hotel rooms to people in tent encampments and those that are living unsheltered on sidewalks and in doorways. That program has had great success in moving people inside and not involving the police department, in not sweeping people from one sidewalk to the next or one park to the next. Over this last week on 3rd Avenue at 3rd and Pike, Just Care moved 31 people off the sidewalk between Union and Pike into hotel rooms, connected to counseling, treatment, services, never once involved the Seattle Police Department. This is the effort and the approach that this charter amendment looks to scale throughout our city so that we can respond with more urgency to this emergency, bring people inside, not move them from one park to the next. That's in effect what we've been doing as a city over the last 5 or 6 years. It's not been helpful for those that are suffering outside, not been helpful for those that have an interest in using our parks and public spaces, and overall been expensive and largely ineffective. So this builds on approaches we know that work, approaches that we've tested and piloted here, and also those that are in place in other parts of the United States, in cities and communities that are having an impact on reducing the chronically homeless population within their own community. So the amendment and petition is available for signature out throughout the city of Seattle, or you can download the petition itself from compassionseattle.org, sign it, and return it to the address that's listed. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today and look forward to questions from our moderator and your questions as well.
Thank you for that introduction, John. Okay, so we'll dive into some questions. So first, you listed off a number of organizations that have consulted on this charter amendment. Can you tell me how involved has the currently unhoused or recently unhoused populations or organizations that are comprised and led by them, have they actually been consulted as part of this charter amendment's development?
Well, through some of the specific individuals that were leading organizations who then who they themselves had lived experience. There's been involvement and perspective from them. We've engaged the Lived Experience Coalition recently. That's a part of the Regional Homelessness Authority. And we'll be setting up an implementation plan and approach that involves individuals with lived experience.
So, okay. And are you at all concerned that there seems to be a coalition of folks with lived experience who are opposed to this charter amendment? Does that at all cause you to rethink your approach here? If significant numbers of folks who are on the street say this is not the right approach, would that cause you to recalibrate?
Yeah, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen a significant number of folks with lived experience that have opposed this measure. And again, we consulted with more than a dozen organizations that have decades of experience serving individuals with lived experience. And they had a direct hand, including in some that had their own lived experience, in providing input in language and on the actual amendment. And this is in many ways a framework and a policy approach, and there's an implementation plan and set of actions that will be necessary should this pass and should this be adopted by voters. And the Lived Experience Coalition with the Regional Homelessness Authority and others with lived experience absolutely should have an opportunity to provide input and bring their important perspective to how this is implemented and effectuated.
So one of the concerns that folks have around this amendment is that it's potentially an unfunded mandate. So through making this a charter amendment, there's a lot of squishy language around it is city policy, the city shall fund, that could be tied up in the courts, but it doesn't necessarily give positive rights for Seattle residents on the street. A right to affordable housing, a right to mental health services. Why is it framed more as kind of a methodology of when and how people can be cleared out of our parks, rather than just a method of funding the services that are needed?
Well, this is a mandate. I mean, should this pass, this is enshrined in our city's constitution, the charter, and the language, if you read through the amendment itself, mandates the city develop at least 2,000 units of temporary and permanent supportive housing within the first year of adoption. It mandates investment and provision of treatment services, both mental health and substance use. It mandates investment in diversion programs to divert people from the criminal legal system. So in every sense of the word, this is a mandate. And it mandates the city prioritize funding to bring these services and this housing to folks that need it most. And we do not lack resources around this issue today. We're spending more today than we ever have before. And the city of Seattle is receiving $240 million of federal money from the Biden administration over the next 11 months or so. There's $5 billion in the most recent American Recovery Act dedicated to homelessness services that the city of Seattle will be eligible for. And if the city believes they need to raise additional taxes to implement the plan, they're free to do that themselves or present that tax measure to voters. You cannot raise a tax or levy a tax through a charter amendment, so we're not permitted to do that. But what this does is sets up a clear approach, which is what we've lacked around this issue. We've been spending lots of money over the last 6-7 years, more and more every year, but we see more and more people outside. And there is no plan at City Hall around chronic homelessness. There's no plan around a crisis emergency response to stand up temporary housing. We've seen the tiny homes and other investments that have been made. They take too long to come online. We haven't acted with a greater sense of urgency. So what this puts in place is a plan and an approach. We haven't invested in treatment. And then should the
be
city
clear, I
decide they need additional
Can
tax
I
revenue?
actually ask my question? To be clear, I said an unfunded mandate. I think you then said, yes, it is a mandate, but you did not address the unfunded part. Because many of the backers of this amendment, including Downtown Seattle Association, have consistently opposed new progressive taxation. So are you expecting the full cost of this to come from the American Rescue Plan, or how are you expecting the city to pay for this? And if you continue to oppose new revenue, what is going to be cut in favor of funding these measures?
Well, the city of Seattle ultimately has its own authority to levy taxes themselves legislatively or to present a plan to voters. This doesn't prevent them from doing that. I do believe that the $240 million coming to the city of Seattle should be prioritized on this issue. I think it's the #1 crisis in our city. I don't think we should tell the people that are suffering the most that they get the last dollar or that they have to wait in the parks and sleep out there until we raise the next tax. We've gone through the greatest economic expansion in this city's history over the last 10 years, and we've continued to tell poor people suffering in our parks that we're just one tax away from helping you. I think that's unacceptable. I think we should give them the first dollar, not the last.
Sure. I think that there's a strong agreement from many sides that we need to actually invest in the services that folks need. I think, though, there are also concerns about you mentioned this mandates 2,000 units of housing. Microsoft research in 2019 found that Seattle needs 200,000 more affordable homes, and yet that's not in the budget. And so why put forward a proposal that doesn't include a funding source? Why didn't you go through actually figuring out the funding instead of just mandating changes that include encampment removal policies?
Well, the mandates are that we invest in treatment and mental health and emergency housing and the set of services that we know are important to bringing people inside. The set of services that were provided to 31 people out on 3rd and Pike over the last couple of days by the Public Defender Association and Just Care that successfully moved them inside. So that's what this mandates, an approach we know works. Because the status quo doesn't, because the status quo is resulting in us spending more money as a city and seeing more people suffering outside and seeing people die in encampments like what we saw tragically this last week in Mount Baker. So this is a mandate to step away from the status quo and to do things differently, certainly. Doesn't limit the city's ability to raise new taxes, to propose new taxes to voters, to raise them directly. There's no limitation here. It doesn't raise a tax directly because the charter amendment doesn't allow us to, isn't permitted to do that under city law. So this doesn't in any way tie the hands of city government and how they fund this. Again, I would offer the perspective that there's been plenty of money available to the city of Seattle over the last several years in just local taxes that have been driven by our economic growth. And then a historic amount of federal dollars that are coming directly to the city of Seattle, as well as King County. And then those dollars that are available generally for homeless response that are available to municipalities across the country. So I don't think it's the progressive thing to do, the moral thing to do, the right thing to do, to tell people that are suffering outside that we can't help you until we raise a new city tax.
So the thing I want to push back on is you said that you chose to do a charter amendment because a charter amendment indicates how important this is. Yet you're also saying we can't raise money through the charter amendment because it's a charter amendment. So was that not an intentional choice to put something on the ballot that did not have a funding mechanism?
No, we elected to file a charter amendment versus an initiative because an initiative can be changed by the city council. A charter amendment cannot. It would have to be sent back to the voters. And we've seen so much dysfunction, arguing, bickering, no alignment, no consensus within our legislative branch or our executive branch of city government around this crisis over the last decade, which has resulted in 4,000 people being unsheltered, that we felt it was important for voters to have their say and for their say to be the law of the land. And if the city wants to take a different approach, they can present one back to voters.
Okay, so moving on, And starting in 2019, there was a steep increase in the number of encampment removals that were performed by the city that were designated as being due to camp obstructions, and therefore were exempted from typical outreach requirement. So your proposed charter amendment states, quote, "While there is no right to camp in any particular public space, it is city policy to avoid, as much as possible, dispersing people except to safe and secure housing, unless remaining in place poses particular problems related to public health or safety or interferes with the use of public spaces by others. In those circumstances where the city does not close an encampment, the city may still require individuals to shift their belongings and any structures to ensure safety, accessibility, and to accommodate use of public spaces." So I want to know what in this language fundamentally shifts the status quo. What about this is better for marginalized people, since that is the purported goal of this charter amendment?
Because the city would be required to provide culturally appropriate outreach and services, because the city would be required to provide treatment and housing, not a mat on the floor of a congregate shelter, but permanent and temporary housing. This moves us away from the shelter model that is what the city has relied upon for many, many years, and has told people living in parks that you got to get out of this park, and we've got a shelter for you downtown that doesn't open till 8 o'clock. You got to stand outside in the rain, and you can't bring your belongings or your dog or your partner. And oh, by the way, you've got to leave at 6 a.m. after you've slept 6 inches from 200 other people. That's effectively the approach that we've taken and what we've offered. And by the way, there's no treatment, there's no case management, there's no counseling that you're going to get in that shelter. So this is different in every sense of the word, because this requires a robust set of services that people need and that we know work to bring people inside. And it requires a city to provide and offer those services, just like we saw at 3rd and Pike over these last 7 days by the incredibly talented and dedicated team at Just Care that worked over this last weekend to bring 31 people off that sidewalk, never once involving the Seattle Police Department.
So in terms of the amendment's goal, there's a big difference between permanent housing and emergency shelter. So within the charter amendment, the 2,000 unit goal, it states that it could be either permanent housing or emergency shelter. Was there a reason why these goals weren't articulated separately? Like, would it be acceptable to you if the entirety of the 2,000 units ended up being emergency shelter and not permanent housing?
We didn't specify a ratio because we wanted to allow for flexibility for the city and how they implemented that goal, recognizing that it's unlikely that they're going to go build brand new housing within this next year to meet the requirements, but they certainly could acquire existing buildings like what King County is doing right now through the Health Through Housing initiative. We think that's smart to go out and acquire properties, assisted living facilities, motels, hotels that are available because of the unique economic conditions that we have here within the city and within the county. But we also recognize that there's going to need to be, additional tiny homes that, 1 or 2 year leases on hotels may be also a solution here. So we wanted to maintain flexibility, but the real objective is to stand up 2,000 individual units of housing as soon as possible.
And so as a final question, because before we go to audience questions, this is actually one that was submitted ahead of time, but kind of speaks to my personal experience with a family member who is going through crisis. As a mental health counselor, I know that an individual's readiness for change is often the #1 factor in the effectiveness of their treatment. Do you believe that unhoused individuals should be required to undergo mental health and substance use disorder treatment as a condition of their housing?
Not necessarily. No. I mean, I don't think that's proven to be effective. I mean, forced treatment is never an effective approach.
Okay, well, I know that we're trying to keep on time here. So I'm going to call out to my tech team to help get some of these audience questions spotlighted.
Yes, thank you to everyone who's been messaging myself and Maddie at the 43rd Democrats account. We have some audience questions, so we're going to be calling people to ask them in the order that they were submitted, prioritizing folks with lived experience with homelessness. So to start us off, we have Paige Owens. I'm going to unmute you and go ahead and ask your question.
Because of my experience being homeless, I am all too familiar with being swept and how detrimental this is for one's stability physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and financially. IDs and medications and tents are not cheap. You say that Compassion Seattle isn't about sweeps, but how do you explain this line from your proposed charter amendment? In those circumstances where the city does not close an encampment, the city may still require individuals to shift their belongings and any structures to ensure safety, accessibility, and to accommodate use of public spaces. Shifting folks without housing is a sweep. And I want to also add to that if you don't have that housing yet, because it is going to take a year for those 2,000 units to even be built, where are you going to shift those people to in order to keep, their belongings and keep them in some sort of stable position?
Well, we're attempting to balance a lot of interest and needs here, and the use of the right-of-way by individuals and parks and public spaces and transit corridors and transit stops. So, we think it's first and foremost that we need to be making available treatment, counseling, case management, and housing before anybody is asked to move. But in certain cases where there's obstructions and people, like they were on 3rd Avenue over the last several months, are forced to walk in the street to navigate the sidewalk because it's blocked, that there are certain cases like that where it's appropriate to balance the needs and interests of all Seattleites so that there's access and ADA access and people being able to get on a bus and wait for a bus. But the real intent of this amendment is to bring people inside, not to move them around, not to shift them from one park to the next, but to bring people inside.
All right, thank you. The next question is Ariana. So Ariana, I'm going to ask you to unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question.
As an autistic trans woman fleeing abuse, when I was unhoused, displacement known as sweeps caused me extreme trauma. The temporary services available were not a suitable alternative to the stability I had found in my tent. The trauma of displacement led to relocation stress syndrome, which inevitably extended my time being unhoused and continues to torment me a year later. We are facing an influx in the unhoused population. How is it okay to encourage displacement policies that increase the trauma that people already face when living on the streets?
The amendment's not about displacement. It's not about sweeps. It's about bringing people inside and offering the set of services and types of housing that we know have been successful in doing that. The status quo has resulted in more people outside than there were 2 years ago. The current approach is more expensive than it was 2 years ago, and we're seeing more people suffer. We're trying to address a growing crisis, a humanitarian crisis on our street, by providing the services and housing that are important to bringing people inside.
All right, our next question is from Latanya. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Let me know if I didn't. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello, thank you. Latanya, these them pronouns. I guess my question is, why, so much concern from the business community, DSA, the chamber for addressing homelessness in Seattle. Why not pay for it? Are you all in support of taxing business to pay for homelessness issue in Seattle?
Well, the business community is paying more taxes today than ever before in the city of Seattle. The city's general fund is larger than it's ever been, and the city's the dollars the city's getting from the federal government are dollars that we've never gotten at this level. So those are dollars we believe should be going to those with the least and those that are suffering the most in our public spaces. We have a record amount of revenue coming to the city of Seattle. We should choose to spend it on the services and the housing that we know are important to bringing people inside. That's what this charter amendment requires.
All right, our next question is from Susan. Susan, I will ask you to unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Susan.
Hi. I understand that you want to provide shelter or housing, two very different things, to up to 2,000 people. You're aware that there are approximately 12,000 people living unsheltered, half of them in vehicles. And what will happen to those other 10,000 people, especially if you start the sweeps before you have the shelter in place? That's 10,000 people that are not provided for in this initiative. Will they go to jail? Will they be sent? Where are they going to go? We know there's no place for them. I've been volunteering and advocating on behalf of homeless people for about 12 years. There is no low-income permanent supported housing, which is not what you're proposing to build. Where do those other 10,000 people go?
No, thanks for the question, Susan. And the 12,000 number, as I understand it, is countywide, so not all 12,000 unsheltered or in RVs within the city of Seattle. So that's throughout the county. So the number unsheltered within the city of Seattle, I think, is now approaching 4,000. So in the 2,000 unit requirement of the charter amendment is what's required in the first year. There's nothing that prevents the city of Seattle from doing more than that. And certainly the law would be on the books for that they would be required to continue to invest to bring everybody inside that's currently chronically homeless. This charter amendment and the investments that are required also complement the leadership of County Executive Dow Constantine and through the Health Through Housing program, which is going to stand up 1,600 units of housing throughout King County with a significant amount of housing within the city of Seattle. And also we have additional housing coming online that has been invested in over this last year. So the 12, you're right that we've got 12,000 folks throughout the county that are unsheltered or experiencing homelessness, but that's not the number within the city of Seattle.
Okay, our next question is coming from Aaron. Aaron, I will unmute you.
Hi, yeah, my name's Erin, and I've been a case manager for a long time. I'm not currently a case manager for people experiencing homelessness, but I know that there's a big difference between permanent and temporary housing. And I know that standing up 2,000 units as soon as possible can bring on the problem of not having appropriate staff trained to support those people. And for a lot of people, I think living homeless, people need a lot of support, need a lot of support to keep them in the housing. So because a lot of times people, will go back to the street because living in the housing isn't sustainable for them. And so if there's not those supports in place, then that's really not going to work out so well. So what would you do to make there be enough people to support the people, especially at the wages that people are paid? And my second question is, are you in favor of taxing very large corporations such as Amazon so they're truly paying their fair share to support people who are experiencing homelessness?
To your first question, Erin, I think in many ways we've been trying to do this work on the cheap, and it's very expensive to do it that way. And we're returning a lot of people to homelessness because we aren't providing the services that people need to get stabilized, the services they need to deal with their mental health conditions and substance use. And we've sort of shoved them in overnight shelters and sort of hoped that on their own somehow they would get better. And then we scratched their head that they're still in the shelter 6 years later. And this amendment fundamentally changes course on that approach, which is, I think, in many ways responsible for the situation we see out on the streets today, and where people would much rather be in their tent than they would in a shelter that's not helping them stabilize their life and move them forward. So this requires the investment in the set of services, and importantly, treatment that we know is so critical to helping people stabilize their lives. And then with regard to companies paying taxes in our city, again, I would say they're paying more today than they ever have before. The city of Seattle's payroll tax was upheld in court recently, so they'll all be paying more next year than they're paying more today. I don't find it a progressive position to continue to tell poor people in our city that we need to raise, that we can't help them until we raise the next tax. The city has more money today than ever before, and we're still telling that to poor people. We don't have enough for you, because we've said you get the last dollar, not the first. I think we should prioritize our spending on those with the least, those that are suffering and dying in our parks.
All right, we have time for one last question. And so this question is coming from Amy Madden. Amy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm trying to turn on my video here. Oh, okay, here we go. I'm so sorry. Hi, my name is Amy Madden. I serve on the board of the 43rd Democrats. I'm a survivor of childhood homelessness in Seattle in the year 1990. I'm a former coordinator of the U District Youth Shelters as well. My family was unsheltered due to my father slipping through the cracks of the Veterans Administration. He was 100% disabled due to the trauma and injury he sustained during 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. I was 14 at the time, and my 4 siblings were younger. During our time without housing, we couch surfed, slept in a car, and stayed in a tent. What helped us was housing. The city of Seattle provided us our own safe, lockable unit in a building on Yesler for families. Because we had that safe housing, my mother was able to save up money working as a nurse's aide to be able to afford a rental. If authorities had come along, swept our tent, or forced us to go inside somewhere that wasn't actual housing, it would have heaped trauma upon a family that was already dealing with many levels of trauma. It would have made our situation significantly worse. Housing first works, and the research and data shows this to be the case. Why are we even talking about encampment removals before we fully funded the housing we need? Thank you.
Well, we believe the charter amendment is necessary because we're seeing more people outside year after year. We're losing ground as a city. We're not able to bring the number of people that need housing inside. And this requires a city to respond to this emergency accordingly, to continue to invest in permanent supportive housing and permanent housing, which is critical to ending this crisis, but to also acknowledge that a lot of that housing is going to take many years to come online, and that it's inhumane to tell people to continue to sleep on 3rd Avenue or in a cold, dark alley or in a park until the keys are delivered to them in 3 or 4 or 5 years. We need to offer better, safer, healthier alternatives with treatment and other supportive services that are critical to saving lives and ensuring people get healthy and get stable. And that's what this charter amendment does. We don't believe that we should continue to say the best we can do is 3rd Avenue, a sidewalk, an alley, or a park, and we'll be back to you in a few years with a key to a permanent supportive housing unit. I would also say that there's nothing in this charter amendment that stops the city of Seattle from addressing their own zoning and land use limitations that restrict the amount of housing that can be built within the city. In many ways, this is a self-inflicted wound. We've restricted micro units, which the market was delivering. We've restricted other types of housing that has contributed to the affordability crisis and contributed to the number of people sleeping on the streets. The city of Seattle is free to address those land use limitations and restrictions today.
Thank you. And that is going to conclude our audience questions. And first, I just want to thank all the folks who asked questions, especially those who talked about sometimes very vulnerable experiences. Sometimes I think probably very traumatic experiences. And so thank you for reliving those, for doing us all a service by bringing up your lived experience. Second, I want to say thank you for John. I know we threw a lot of questions at you. I would give you this opportunity to do one last pitch. And if people want to get involved with the campaign, how can they do so?
Well, thanks. No, I really appreciate the opportunity. And these are the types of conversations that we ought to be having in this city about what I think is the most significant crisis that we face. And so I appreciate the constructive dialogue and your great questions. You can read the initiative, the charter amendment yourself at compassionseattle.org. You can see what others are saying about it, including many of the nonprofit service and housing providers that had input on the language. And you can download and sign a petition. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you. Okay, next up, we're going to talk to Dee Powers. So I gave a bio of Dee before, but just to refresh people's memories, they are the president of the board of the organization Be Seattle, which works to connect people with resources in order to help and empower both houseless and renter neighbors. And they've been running an amazing mutual aid coordination station called the Way Station. And they also have the lived experience of being priced out of a downtown apartment and currently living in an RV. So Dee, thank you for being here today. We're going to follow a similar format to what we did in the first half, where I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to introduce yourself and why you're here tonight. Then we'll dig into some questions, and then for me, and then we'll go into some audience questions. So
thank you very much.
Go for it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dee Powers, and I am, as I said, the president of the board at Be Seattle and a current vehicle resident. I was priced out of my downtown Seattle apartment in 2015 and was unable to find anything in my price range. Ended up wiping out my savings for an RV, and I've been here ever since. We can't be fooled necessarily by Compassion Seattle's flowery language. This is the Chamber of Commerce, the same folks that are suing the city of Seattle to keep them from implementing the Jumpstart tax. The Jumpstart tax, which would significantly increase funding for permanent, deeply affordable housing. These are the same people that are advertising this with print mailers that simply say temporary housing instead of permanent or temporary now. They're saying there's only 4,000 people living unsheltered in the city of Seattle. Half of the unsheltered population live in vehicles right now. So what about the rest of us? Will there be a multi-pronged approach made by this charter amendment? It's unlikely. He focused on the parks tonight and how we needed to get them cleaned up and get people inside and to stop their suffering. Shifting people along and offering temporary shelter is not a solution. This is an unfunded mandate. It increases funding, according to this, by exactly 1%, from 11 to 12. That doesn't fund the services. I mean, McKinsey recently did a study that they literally determined that we need $450 million to $1 billion annually, regionally, for 10 years, mostly for permanently affordable and supportive housing. The American Recovery Act, Biden's plan, is not going to pay for that. We can't pretend that we don't need more money for this. Unfortunately, we do. There is, with us being in the bottom 5 in the nation for mental health services, forced treatment is not going to be a good choice. Prioritizing treatment may not be the best choice. Instead, what we need to prioritize is permanent housing, supportive housing, housing that comes with the choice of treatment, instead of something that is focused mainly on treatment and less on shelter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. So I want to start us off with, like, this is a deep crisis. It's been at least 40 years in the making. It's rooted not just in local policy, but in federal policy as well. Like, what do you think we as the people, the residents of Seattle, can do to actually start addressing these issues?
First of all, we need to be less NIMBY and more YIMBY. We need to say yes. We can put tiny houses in this neighborhood. Yes, we want RV safe lots with wraparound services. Yes, that hotel can be converted into a shelter. We need to not undermine the Regional Homelessness Authority. They've barely had a chance to start yet, thanks to the pandemic. And we need to make sure that everybody is offered an appropriate step up. At one point, I was offered a tent at Tent City if I was willing to walk away and let them impound my 32-foot motorhome. That's a step down. Thank you very much. There was no promise of housing on the other end of that, and a tent would not have been suitable for my needs.
On that point, I think John touched on this a little bit, but I would love to dig in more. Like, why might offers of shelter not work for everyone? I know from my experience on the LGBTQ Commission, there's a lot around identity, but I would love to hear from your perspective, what would cause someone to say no if someone came and offered them a shelter bed?
I personally don't fit in either set of shelter beds. I am non-binary. They're either men's shelters, women's shelters, or co-ed shelters, and the co-ed shelters are full. That would be the tiny house villages primarily that are co-ed and a couple of the tent cities. I would love a parking spot, to be honest with you, a parking spot that transitions me into an apartment somewhere in Seattle. Unfortunately, we've shut down all of our safe lots. It's unfortunate, but regarding shelter, not every shelter offer meets the needs of the individual it's offered to. Some people have trauma. Some people have severe social anxiety. Some people can't handle sleeping in a room with multiple other people. They need that privacy. They need at least a zipper between them and the world. And curtains between beds and loud noises at night just isn't going to cut it.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that there's beyond that, I've also heard of people not wanting to be separated from their partner or their dog when sometimes their dog is the only person or only companion they have. But
no one will let me move into a shelter with this. Nobody. Isn't that right, baby? No one's going to let me move into a shelter with a cat.
Yes. But I want to dig into, obviously this charter amendment is not coming from nowhere. It seems fair to say that a majority of the city is unhappy with our progress addressing the homelessness crisis and are looking for a solution. And especially during the pandemic, people like me who don't have yards, it was hard when we couldn't also enjoy our parks. It's a human thing. But how do we balance that short-term kind of acute frustrations that people are feeling with the need for longer structural change to get to actual permanent housing being built?
What we need to do rather than continuously saying no to people, no, you can't camp here. That shuffles them to the next park down. No, you can't camp here either. That moves them 2 blocks down to a street corner. No, you can't camp here. Now they don't even have a tent because the sweeps have taken everything they own and they're sleeping in a doorway. This doesn't work. So we need to find somewhere to say yes. Because Martin versus Boise says we can't be criminalizing homelessness. We can't be criminalizing basic needs like sleep if we don't have an alternate solution. We keep saying no and have very few yeses. We need a lot more.
And I would love also pivoting off of that a little bit, for you to respond to the idea that around the funding for this. So John mentioned several times that the business community is paying the most that it's ever paid, and that there's a lot of wealth in this city. But there's also obviously a lot of folks who are falling into housing instability. And so what do you think that the business community's role in this should be?
Well, the business community, their role should be continuing to pay the taxes that are being levied upon them. They can fight taxes if they desire to, and perhaps they will win. But the business community is more than welcome to advocate to keep tents directly out from in front of their businesses. But they need to start finding, we all need to start finding alternatives. We need to find a way to say yes to people instead of saying no. I'll keep saying that all day long, but unfortunately the business community has a lot of no answers right now. No, we don't need more money. No, we're not in favor of Jumpstart. No, the city council and the mayor has no plan. But there's very few yeses involved with their charter amendment. There's a lot of flowery language, but no concrete solution, except for those 2,000 temporary or permanent beds, where their latest print mailer literally just said temporary.
So if they don't have a lot of concrete solutions, what are the concrete solutions that we need?
We need a multi-pronged approach. We need not just hotel shelter, but we need tiny house villages. We need RV parks with wraparound services for vehicle residents. We need thousands upon thousands of units of deeply affordable permanent housing, both supportive and non-supportive. We need units not just for the houseless, but for the working poor, the ones who are stuck in 2 part-time minimum wage jobs outside of the city's limits that can't afford to live anywhere near where they are. And they end up in a vehicle so they can live closer to work. We need to be able to give yes answers to every plan that comes across that desk that gives a concrete solution.
So these solutions, it sounds like, really do need a mayor and a city council that are on the same page and working towards solving this crisis with urgency.
Yes.
If we come across the same situation after the next election where we have a city council and a mayor that are at odds over approach, how are we going to force them to take action? The charter amendment proponents say that their solution is the way that we actually force action, but what is the alternative to saying, like, no, we actually need to act on this crisis?
Well, people power is a wonderful thing. We can start saying yes and setting up community-led tiny house villages like Nicholsville. We can start saying, yes, you can park that RV in this neighborhood, and we won't call the police on you. We can start reaching out and befriending our houseless neighbors a little at a time and getting to know them a bit more, finding out their concrete needs, and then helping them directly. I know that not everybody's got the wherewithal to go and meet someone new in this crazy pandemic era, but it does help a lot just to smile at someone as you're walking down the street. But as for concrete stuff, People Power works wonderful. Nicholsville did such a wonderful job. And then there's the small organizations and their funded projects like the Share Wheel Women's Shelter that recently opened at First Presbyterian. That's a good example of nonprofits using community-driven efforts to make a difference.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we heard kind of early on in the first section was that there was no significant pushback from unhoused people against the charter amendment. As someone who, I would like your perspective on that.
Everybody I have spoken to so far has said that this, once they've read through it, they go, okay, this is a lot of flowery language with nothing behind it. Where is the funding? Where is the housing? Why are they only giving us 2,000 units when by their estimates, there's 4,000 people? And most of the folks out here say there's closer to 10 to 12 out here right now. The one night count last year was a failure because of the pandemic. Countywide, yes, 12,000 is probably a close to accurate number for the one night count, but they didn't step off the sidewalks this year. So we probably do have 12,000 in Seattle proper, hidden in the green belts and deeper in. They've scooted closer and closer to services as the years progressed because they haven't been being swept as readily and because those streets were empty of people. They felt safe to do so for the first time in potentially years. They felt safe to bring their tent out of the bushes and into the public eye, which is a huge risk for any houseless person to take.
And one thing, I've participated in the point in time count a couple of times myself. One thing that I know that they don't actually cover with that count because it's not part of the Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Housing and Urban Development definition of being homeless are folks who are in a shelter that is not their permanent home. So people who live in motels. My brother lived on my couch for several months when he tried to move here. Couldn't find a place that actually worked in his price range, except for some place that tried to scam him out of basically all of his money. And he eventually had to give up and go to Olympia. So, for that period of time, he was homeless. And he's not captured by the point in time count. So we were probably significantly undercounting the number of folks who are unstably housed, not just on the street.
Absolutely. We are absolutely undercounting, and 2,000 beds isn't enough. The eviction moratorium ends at the end of the month, and there are 44,000 households in King County at risk of immediate eviction if that ends up happening. The aid is not being dispersed quickly enough. So let's say half of those people get the aid they need, or a place to stay, or have friends or family they can move in with. That's still 22,000 people countywide that suddenly are houseless. That's quadrupling the number that they're current, at least that Compassion Seattle is estimating as an unsheltered population. And that's significant. We need to think about what's coming versus what already is.
Yes, and
we
speaking
need
of
bigger plans.
Speaking of what's coming, and I know that my time asking questions is gonna wrap up soonish. But what happens if this is passed? What is the next step for your coalition, for people who are interested in advocating for those who are unhoused? Is it to work with the people who are pushing this charter amendment? Is it something else? What does that future?
First off, we need to say no to Charter Amendment 29. We need to be working with a coalition of people who understand that housing first is the goal. It is not a pipe dream, such as Real Change News, Share Wheel, Nicholsville, Decriminalize Seattle, Seattle, and many others. There's a whole coalition of us that are ready to accept you with open arms if you want to sign on and help us find a way to solve this issue in a more compassionate way than Compassion Seattle. And that would be houseourneighbors.org.
Absolutely. And I will give you more time to do your wrap up and everything after the questions. But like they may collect all the signatures to get on the ballot. The ballot initiative may pass. What does that future look like for those who are fighting for our unhoused neighbors? Like how do you plan on pushing for the policies that you're pushing for now in that scenario?
Should we pretend that it passes altogether, or should we pretend that we're voting no still?
So I am clear you want us to decline to sign and you want us to vote no, but we're pretending that.
So let's pretend it's a future with Compassion Seattle. We are going to need to push the city and the county very heavily to expand whatever Compassion Seattle is offering, because it's not enough. And we also need to continue to demand the city to stop the sweeps, stop the shuffle, give people a yes so they can be stabilized while we're getting them housing. Because if you sweep people, you can't find them again. How are they supposed to get shelter if you can't find them? So what we need is to keep being active in local government and making our demands that this is what we want. And yes, the Compassion Seattle folks are correct. We need to be spending the first dollar, not the last. But this is probably not the way to do it.
Sorry. Okay, I know that we have a couple of audience questions. So I'm going to let Camille handle getting those folks spotlighted. Thank you for answering my questions, Dee. But we'll hand it over to the folks in the audience.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have our first question coming from Ariana. Ariana, I will ask you to unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question. You should be unmuted now, Ariana.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So we have 28,000 vacancies in the greater Seattle area, yet 90% of evictions result in becoming unhoused. How do we get our unhoused population into the housing that is available?
Ooh, that is a difficult question. First off, we need to put them in it. We need to provide supportive services out here on the streets. We need to take those units and make sure that they are affordable enough that we can put people inside them within weeks rather than years. And with that many units coming available, we need to make sure that Airbnb doesn't rope them all in and we can actually have access to them. The city and the county need to expand the HEN program, the Housing and Essential Needs program, significantly. That provides a subsidy for people coming out of homelessness for their first apartment. It is a brilliant program, but unfortunately is a very limited amount of time for any person's in any single person's household. So an extension of that would be immense.
Great, thank you for the question and the answer. Next, we have Al. I'm going to try and find you, Al, so that I can unmute you. All right, Al, you have been asked to unmute and you can ask your question.
Okay, yeah. So my question was, I think if I understand the charter people, I'm not particularly a huge fan of it, but if I understand them, their point is the city of Seattle has a $6.6 billion a year annual budget, the city itself, And yet we can't find 2 billion, which is what I think was the estimate from those consultants of how much would it cost to house everybody in King County. So their point is like, screw it, let's just make them do it, make them spend the money. And when I look around, I live in Ravenna, and here in Roosevelt, they've built thousands of units of small apartments, many studios. The city could just buy them all and use them for affordable and or free housing for the homeless. So there is a solution, and we have a tremendous amount of money in the city. And yet, if I look at that 230 million that came in through recently from the feds, I think 40 million ended up going for homeless needs out of the latest budget. So why wasn't all 230 million used to buy apartments in Seattle to house the homeless? That's my question. I mean, I think the charter amendment, their point seems to be, it should be the first priority, not the last. And they're trying with the charter amendment to make it the first priority. Is that a mistake?
No, I absolutely agree with them that it should be the first dollar rather than the last. However, their charter amendment isn't giving enough structure to it to actually make that money get spent. 2,000 units isn't going to eat up that funding, is going to eat up what little funding we have, but we're going to need more to bring the rest of everybody else inside. Yes, the city should definitely buy those units and put people in them, but the Landlords Association is probably not going to let us do that. They're going to want to keep their investments intact. And providing below market rate housing is not profitable. So it's a matter of getting them to say, we have to get people to say yes to stuff instead of no. And although this mandate requires some yeses, it's also giving the go-ahead to continue to shuffle around in the parks. And their advertising really is about, hey, let's clean up the parks and put these people that are highly visible in these 2,000 units. That will leave people like me who live on the outskirts of the city out of main view, completely out of the loop. I will end up still out here once those 2,000 units are full.
Thanks for that question, Al. I would just like to highlight that we are out of audience questions, but we still have a little bit more time. So if you're someone who has been shy, but has a burning question, now's your chance. We have some time to fill, so come on forward. Don't be scared. D doesn't bite.
Looks like Sue has a question. Susan, I will unmute you.
What do you make of the fact that the Compassion Seattle listed about a dozen organizations with whom they had consulted and then listed them as endorsers? And when they got busted by Erica C. Barnett and ProPublica, they promptly took their page down. I really can't believe anything they have to say. That was outrageous.
I totally agree with you. The fact that they had a huge endorser list, including many of the organizations that he mentioned by name tonight, were on their endorser page, including DESC. I can't even recite the full list that he gave, but the majority of them were on the endorser page. And as soon as they got called out on it, the endorser page came down. Yet he still name dropped all those names tonight right here in our conversation. So no, there was a lot of very good professional language tonight, but very little concrete, solutions that would actually work beyond just, here's 2,000 beds.
Thanks for that question, Susan. It looks like Sean Butterfield has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point, and I'd like, Dee, I hope we'll have something to follow up with on it. But, and thank you so much for your wonderful contribution. You've been really great in sort of exposing the sort of slick lie that I think this charter amendment represents. But one thing I wanted to address that I don't think has been properly addressed is that the city, yes, it has the most money it's ever had, but the costs to provide housing and to provide services have gone up at an even greater rate because housing is increasingly unaffordable. And that's why the problem keeps getting worse despite the city spending ever more money year after year. We just can't keep up with the rise in the cost of housing as that forces more people into homelessness. And I feel like DESC, in many city council public comment periods, as folks from that organization have made that point repeatedly. And it's one that I really feel like in our opposition to this charter amendment, we need to stress. It's like, yes, the cost of housing is going up. So, at this point, you've really done a great job, I think. But yes, the solution to this problem is to reduce the cost of housing. So that means passing a tax on unoccupied properties, quadrupling the property tax on unoccupied properties, or doubling the property tax on properties that don't involve, I'm sorry, I was distracted. Doubling the property taxes on properties that are rented at market rate or above. They have to be below market rate or below 50%, or sorry, below a third of half of area median income.
Like tax credit units. Tax credit units, they're a big deal.
Sean, I'm just going to turn this into a question.
Sorry, that's the point I wanted to make, and I'm hoping Dee will sort of follow on and fill in the gap.
I can totally respond to this, although I am no tax expert, unfortunately, but I can say that permanent supportive housing is pretty freaking expensive. We are looking at extra staffing, extra security, extra help, social workers, which are not cheap, as well as sanitary, clean, sanitary, structurally sound housing that is single unit. The funding could be made available if we just defunded the police and maybe took a tiny pinch from our parks fund, since it gets number 2 in funding. I love our parks too much to say more than that, though.
Sounds like Camille has another question lined up. Thank you for responding to that one, Dee.
Hi, Dee. Latanya here again. I just wanted to know, I know that Compassion Seattle has a lot of canvassers out, giving a lot of misinformation similar to what John was giving earlier. Can people remove their name from the Compassion Seattle petition if they find out that what they signed for isn't what aligns with their values or what they want for the city?
Someone else posed this question to me earlier. I'm going to have to get back to you because I actually don't know the answer to that question. I think you can mail in something that says I didn't want my name on it, but I actually am not sure. So I will look it up and let you know.
We actually have a link from the Secretary of State on how to potentially remove your name that I think someone can throw into the chat here. But
that would be so useful.
It sounds like there is a potential route to doing that.
Thank you, Jesse. That is really good information to know.
I went out on Saturday to the district fair to hand out flyers and educate people not to sign the petition. And I had thought that what we would be doing is to eventually have a clipboard with a place where people put their signatures to say, I signed, but I was lied to. Is that something that you would recommend, that we ask people, have you signed this? And do you know what's really going on? And if you have signed it, would you like to have your name taken off? Sign here.
Oh, I think we have to go through the form that Jesse just put in the link to get your name officially removed. But we do have, House Our Neighbors does have a decline to sign form going around that allows people, before they sign the Compassion Seattle petition, to sign their name to ours and say, no, I will not be signing this. So preemptive strike, perhaps.
And thank you to the 43rd team who got that link in there so quickly. Camille, are there more questions pending?
I have not received any more questions. Please let me know if you have one, but we're also coming close. Susan has another question. You need to unmute yourself, Susan.
How do I capture that very long URL on the chat? Because as soon as the meeting gets over, it all goes away. And I'm trying to write it all down, but I have a feeling you're going to zap the meeting out before I can write it all down. Can it be posted somewhere like on How's Our Neighbors? Facebook?
It is on the 43rd District Democrats Twitter now.
I don't do Twitter. So where can it be that an old person like me can find it?
We will also put it on the Facebook live stream.
If you click the link now, it'll sit in Chrome.
Oh,
if you click that link now, it'll still be there when Zoom is gone.
I'm on my iPad. I can't get Zoom on my big computer. So how do I save it on my iPad? This happens
just click it to open it, and it should open on Safari.
Susan, if you send your email to one of the co-hosts, we can follow up and send it to you directly.
Okay, because it's not.
Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Because this is the problem with every Zoom meeting.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I know that we're running close on time. We get another appearance of the cat.
She decided to jump in my lap.
I think we have one more question from our chair, Scott Alspa, to finish us out. There's also a question if this will be on the YouTube. Yes, after we conclude, we will upload this to our YouTube page. But if someone could unmute Scott so he can ask a question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, hi Dee, thanks so much for being here. And thanks Jesse for doing such a great job moderating. My question is, members of our organization, the 43rd Dems, are going to be out knocking on doors and talking to voters on the phone, both in the primary and then in the general when Compassion Seattle might be on the ballot. And I'm wondering what you think we should, folks who might oppose this, what the message should be to voters who are really, I think very understandably, very frustrated by the lack of progress on I think people care about our houseless neighbors and want to do something. And I think it's going to be a challenge to, they're going to want to vote for something that purports to make progress. So what would your message be to people who are maybe not as plugged in and aren't watching this forum and aren't following our Twitter, but what should folks be sharing with their neighbors?
What folks should be sharing is that Compassion Seattle is a very misleading charter amendment, and that they shouldn't be fooled by its flowery, compassionate language, because it doesn't increase funding for housing beyond an additional 1%. It doesn't stop the sweeps. They left explicit language about shifting people's belongings in tents. And it's run by big business interests that are suing the city right now to keep them from implementing the jumpstart tax, which would actually pay for housing. So yes, we need a solution, but this ain't it.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that wraps up our audience questions. And we will do the same thing that we did with John, where I'll give you kind of a last minute to wrap up your pitch and tell people how they can get involved if they're interested in joining your coalition.
Well, to wrap up, we need to make sure that we understand that solving homelessness is really a fairly simple process. We need to make sure that there's enough deeply affordable permanent housing to cover the fact that low wages and no social safety net have been able to be gained by our poorest members of society. We need to stop the sweeps rather than continue the cycle of abuse and torment. And we need to be able to do this in a way that is compassionate rather than falsely so. So if you'd like to join up with us, we are at houseourneighbors.org. It is a large coalition of many small nonprofits as well as mutual aid groups. We are working together with the power of people to oppose this amendment. We are definitely looking for volunteers right now from all skill sets, including everything from tabling probably to data entry. So if you're interested in giving us a hand, please sign up on our website and someone will get back to you really quickly. Thank you, Camille.
Yes, Camille just put the website in the chat. But again, thank you, Dee, and thank you to all the folks who came here, who asked great questions, who participated in one way or another. This is how we move the needle on local policy in a way that is driven by people. So with that, I'll hand it over to Camille if there's any last closing things, but thank you all for sticking through this with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jesse, for moderating. I know it's not an easy job. You did a really wonderful job with those questions. Thank you to Dee and John for both being here and attending and answering all of everyone's questions. I know I definitely learned something. I hope that the rest of y'all did too. We will definitely be following up on this issue. For members of the 43rd Dems, we will definitely be looking at this, the policy committee, in the coming month and hopefully bringing it to our next membership meeting. And so, yeah, thank you all for coming. Please email myself or the 43rd Dems if you have any questions, follow-up questions about the issue. Thank you everyone for coming, and that's all we've got for you tonight. There's some links in the chat for becoming a member. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.